I'd like to show you the first round game from the Tata Steel tournament between Ding Liren, rated number 4 in the world, had an amazing 2018 with a 100-game unbeaten run, and he was facing Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, Carlsen with the black pieces. So a really tough game for both players in this first round, and well, this game did not disappoint. Both very enterprising players. A calm start, Areti, and now Carlsen starts to mix things up a little bit with b5. So he is spoiling for a fight in this first round game. And of course one could play gently here with bishop g2 and maybe d3 and so on. But Ding decides, right, I'm going to claim the centre with d4. He is basically a d4 player. So these kind of Queen's Indian positions will be quite familiar to him. But instead of the pawn on b6, the pawn is on b5, which means there is some control over c4. Pawn to e6. And now bishop g5. So there's a struggle over the e4 square taking place, but also this quick development of the queen side could mean that white is intending to attack this pawn on b5 quite quickly. So this is one of the aims, to just facilitate rapid queenside development. So sometimes, for example, these kind of moves are possible, c3 and queen b3 and a4, to chip away at this pawn on b5. And the bishop on g5, well, what's this got to do? Well, apart from rapid mobilization, this is a little bit of a distraction for black as well. Sometimes we can damage the pawns or maybe just drag the queen away. Bishop b7 is possible here for Carlsen, but c5 already, well, it's clear that this is going to be a fantastic fight, challenging the centre. And now it's possible to play quite conservatively here with maybe c3 to support that pawn, or maybe just bishop g2. It's been played before by Kamsky. But d5, really interesting move from Ding. If this pawn is taken, well, we don't have to recapture that with bishop takes knight and queen takes pawn straight away. A couple of moves. Could just play bishop g2 and go for this pawn slowly, or perhaps knight c3 as well. Combination of these moves, and if we can get establish a piece, a knight on d5, and get some light square control, that would be very nice. But Carlsen, instead of taking, played queen a5 check. Interesting idea. Of course, if the check is blocked with, say, a knight or a pawn, then this pawn can be taken. So therefore, bishop d2 is just about forced. And the queen comes back to b6. And now Ding has to think, well, okay, this pawn is sort of left a bit hanging in the middle there somehow, so he exchanges off. And Carlsen recaptures towards the centre. So strategically, we have a very unbalanced position where Carlsen has more pawns in the centre, but who knows, maybe his king could be a little bit insecure if it ends up on the king side. So a very interesting, unusual position. But at the moment, you can see that, well, Ding has a chance to stir things up, while Carlsen has really, well, next to no development here. And even this queen could be a target. But a4 starts the process of softening up squares on the queen side. So, of course, Carlsen doesn't want to have to split pawns by taking this. Strategically, that looks horrible. So he pushes on. But now, well, this is interesting. Also, the c4 square could be available. Ding played a5. And interesting, you could say the most natural move here is just to put the queen back to c7. But Carlsen very quickly put the queen back on d8. I mean, I suppose the one drawback with queen c7 is that it could be vulnerable later on to a hit with bishop f4 once that pawn comes to d5, for example. But still, I think what's impressive here about Carlsen is that he makes a practical decision very quickly. It took him 1 minute to play that move, not more. Queen back to d8. And here, Carlsen thought for, well, just over 9 minutes and rejected a natural developing move, bishop b7, even d5 is possible too, and played knight c6, a highly provocative move. Does not need to do this at all. And Ding certainly is up for a challenge and played knight e5, exploiting this pin on the long diagonal. Very obvious move, but of course Carlsen had anticipated this and was hoping that Ding would go for this one. So he sacrificed an exchange. So this really bizarre position with a bishop trapped in the corner. Well, sort of trapped. a6 means that white can never lose that bishop because it'll anchor itself on b7. But of course, Carlsen's intention is simply to shut that bishop on the other side of the board away from the king side. So that pawn on g3 means that, let's just highlight those squares in red, those light squares around white's king, should it castle on the king side, we'll probably have to castle on the king side, they're going to be weak without the protection of that bishop way across the other side of the board. So a really interesting idea from Carlsen. Bishop d7, attacking the bishop, which just anchors itself on b7. And bishop d6, time to get some pieces out. And Carlsen just wants to get castled and get going on the king side, which, considering the state of white's pieces over here, just way across on the other side of the board, what an attractive idea. So Ding has to work hard. Ding said after the game he thought he was better. Interesting. You know, both players pretty optimistic. So bishop g5 starts to sort out this traffic jam of pieces on the queen side. So obviously making room for the knight to come to d2, absolutely vital. And also, if necessary, white can exchange off one of those dangerous minor pieces on the king side. Knight f7 from Carlsen, so he wants to force an exchange straight away. And now the queen comes to a nice position and two bishops, but both sides have gained something there. Carlsen gets the two bishops, queen comes into play, but Ding is starting to clear the queen side and gets this knight into play. Here an interesting idea is just to shove the h-pawn down the board, actually. It's not so stupid, as the king is reasonably safe in the middle of the board and could potentially still castle on the king side, actually. But after a 21-minute think, Carlsen decided to castle. And Ding, understandably, with pressure on the f-file, castle 2, defending the f2 point. But that meant that Magnus decided it was time to grab something on the queen side. I mean, I guess Black's problem here is that e4 is coming quite quickly, and that will allow the queen to come over to defend on the king side, and that'll start to break up these central pawns, which will mean this bishop could come back into play to defend on the king side. So Carlsen thought, right, now's the time to grab some material. e4, that's, I think, has to be played. So what's Carlsen's idea? You know, he doesn't want to move this pawn. Obviously, I mean, knight c4 looks horrible. Doesn't want to break up these pawns with pawn takes pawn. That's even worse. He found it a really intriguing idea. Well, I'm sure he'd found this about 25 minutes before, actually. And after pawn takes pawn, e5. Now that ensures that this bishop remains shut out of the game, because this pawn on d5 has a very nice blockader on d6. So knight b3 from Ding. Now, if the queens are exchanged, then White doing well in that endgame, because obviously the pressure would be off the king. So Carlsen has to keep the queens on the board, and he manages to do that. So got to avoid a queen trade, but the black queen has found its way over to the king side. And there is still danger here. Just, you know, you can forget these pieces for the time being. They're not contributing to the defense on the king side, which means that it's just down to these pieces at the moment. Well, I should say the knight on d2 came back to d2 to defend f3. That's very important. But black has pressure, knight g5. So all these pieces coming into play, the bishop as well, and this bishop too, as we're about to see. So the game is really reaching boiling point here. If Carlsen has to break through. If he doesn't, then Ding will be the exchange up, and there are a lot of weaknesses here. If Ding can control these squares, land a knight on one of these squares, and, you know, trade queens, take the pressure off the king side, he'll be doing very well. So Carlsen really has to break through here. Now, Ding played in this position bishop c6. I just want to show you one variation. I'm not saying this is necessarily best play, but it just gives you an idea of the kind of latent possibilities in the position and the latent power of black's pieces. So queen e3, let's have a look at this one. Because sometimes e4 could be a problem, and hitting the queen. So queen e3 looks kind of solid. c4, now this is another way to try and bring this bishop into the game. It looks a bit mad because this diagonal is covered by the queen, but just watch. Now the threat is to play c3, drive the knight away, and then black can take on f3. Alright, so what happens on knight c4? Okay, we take, and now it's check, and queen takes. So rook takes, hitting the queen. Okay, let's go for it. Let's be really greedy and find out what's going on. So queen takes pawn on a7. Now clearly, given a couple of moves, this pawn is just going to roll home. Queen number 2, bish bash bosh, end of game. So black has to attack on the king side, and here, in fact, these pieces are so far away, the king doesn't really have any proper defense, so white just has to keep going. And now rook takes pawn, and this is good enough to draw the game. It's not quite a win for black. I mean, the simplest for white is just to play king h1, and then it'll be a draw by perpetual check. But okay, let's see what happens if king f1. If white decides to get a bit frisky and thinks you can win the game. Well, in fact, this is still a draw, should be a draw. The king can't escape, and now the king has to come back, and so on. If the king were to try to run across the board, watch what happens. So king f1 is a draw. King d2 actually loses to this check. I love this combination of queen and bishop, actually. They complement each other beautifully. So the king has to step here, and we take this one, and finally it's a checkmate here. There we are. That's another very nice checkmating pattern with the queen delivering mate, but the pawn controlling those two dark squares. So just to recap, that queen e3 was not played, but very interesting move, c4, just gives black enough in the position to upset white here. Right, the game continuation. Sorry for that huge divergence, but a little detour. But I think that really illustrates the chances that Carlsen has in the position. So bishop c6 played. Now, clearly we don't want to exchange bishops to allow white's queen more scope. So bishop h3. e4 is also possible there, actually, for black. Also a very interesting move. But bishop h3 played, all from Carlsen, excellent move. And now, if that rook moves, let's have a look. If rook f2, then the bishop flies back, hits the queen, threatens knight h3 check with a fork. Black is actually fine there, more than fine. Okay, another possibility. What if the rook comes here? Well, in fact, this is a very powerful move, introducing the bishop potentially into the attack, and after this we take, and well, black's attack is just winning here. Threat of queen g2 mate, and if the queen comes back, then we've got bishop c5. There you go. That is a very important diagonal. So bishop h3, very dangerous. Ding decided to bring the bishop back. So this is the key to this game, actually, that bringing the bishop back to try to defend somehow on the king side. Carlsen grabbed the rook. So material is, yeah, it's now level again. Well, it was level. Carlsen took here. Now, this rook doesn't have to be taken, but if queen e2, black can either play e4, which is interesting, or simply take this, and this leads to a drawn endgame. Black is a pawn up here, but, well, with opposite colour bishops and this knight hopping around, there's no danger of black winning this. But in any case, queen e2 holds no fears for black at all. So Ding decided just to take the rook, and this simplifies straight away. This is the simplest way for white just to steer the game towards a draw. The point is this. Obviously, knight takes knight, queen takes knight. Well, white is just a rook up. So e4. And then forking queen and knight. This gets taken, check, and now we don't want to allow a queen h2 check. So rook takes, so white is just simplifying down to a drawn opposite colour bishop endgame. And here the players decided enough was enough. Yeah, well, clearly once white recaptures this pawn, there's not a lot for either side to play for. What a fantastic fight. Carlsen said afterwards that it's really good to force yourself into playing in the first round to kind of, get the blood flowing. And certainly both players were really up for it there, really enterprising chess. Somehow the Tata Steel tournament seems to just fill the players with this kind of spirit. There is such a good atmosphere in these tournaments, and credit should go to the organisers for putting together such an interesting field of players, young players, very ambitious players, and the top players too. So I hope you all enjoy the tournament and the Power Play coverage. If you're not a subscriber, then do click on the subscribe button, free to subscribe, and click on the bell for instant notifications for when we post a new video. Thanks for watching.